Good evening, generals, and welcome to a new episode of Men Around the Führer. We start tonight's tale by an argument that had been building for months. Two men, one bunker, and the fate of 3 million soldiers hanging in the balance. On one side, a former corporal who believed himself a military genius. On the other, a man with a loaded pistol in his pocket who had been plotting to kill him for 4 years. Franz Halder stood before his commander, maps spread across the table, casualty figures burning holes through his briefing papers. Over 1 million German soldiers dead, wounded, or missing, and the number climbed every day. He told Hitler the truth. The Soviets would raise another million men in 1942, and another million in 1943. The offensive toward Stalingrad was suicide. Hitler's response? He flew into a rage, called Halder an idiot, screamed that the Russians were practically dead already. Within weeks, Halder was gone, dismissed, humiliated, called a little man by the dictator he'd served faithfully through Poland, France, and the bloodiest invasion in human history. Here's the twist that historians still struggle to explain. This man had conspired to overthrow the regime not once, but twice. He had the means. He had the opportunity. He had a loaded pistol that he carried into every meeting with the leader, and every single time, his nerve broke. This is the story of Franz Halder, the chief architect of Germany's greatest military victories, the man who drafted the orders that legalized mass murder on the Eastern Front, the conspirator who could never pull the trigger, and ultimately, the con artist who convinced America that he was a hero. To understand Franz Halder, you need to understand where he came from, not the geography, the psychology. He was born in Würzburg in 1884, but that's almost irrelevant. What matters is the institution that shaped him, the Bavarian military aristocracy. His family had served in the army for 300 years. His father was a general. Military service wasn't a career choice for Franz Halder. It was genetic destiny. He joined an artillery regiment commanded by his own father in 1902. Think about that. From day one, his professional identity was inseparable from family expectation, from tradition, from hierarchy. And here's where it gets interesting from a psychological standpoint. Halder never led troops in combat, not once. During the First World War, while millions died in the trenches, Halder served exclusively in staff positions. He was an administrator, a planner, a man who moved pins on maps while other men bled. He was brilliant at it, no question. He earned the Iron Cross First Class for his organizational work. But there's a difference between a warrior and a bureaucrat, between a man who gives orders and a man who carries them out. Halder was the consummate staff officer, methodical, analytical, detail-oriented. British historian Hugh Trevor Roper captured it perfectly when he wrote that Halder was a military snob, believing that no amateur can ever understand the mysteries of war. This is crucial to understanding everything that follows. Halder saw himself as part of an elite professional caste, the general staff, the inheritors of Prussian military tradition stretching back centuries. In his mind, politicians came and went. Regimes rose and fell, but the army endured. The army was Germany, and Germany was the army. This belief would allow him to rationalize almost anything. By the mid-1930s, Halder had risen through the ranks with quiet efficiency. Lieutenant General by 1936, director of the Wehrmacht's maneuvers staff, a man on the rise. Then came a meeting that would define his destiny. During the 1937 Wehrmacht maneuvers, Halder met the leader face to face for the first time, and something shifted. The historical record is clear. Halder became a loyal supporter. This is a man who had privately criticized the Gestapo, who had reservations about the SS, who came from a Catholic Bavarian military tradition that viewed the newcomers in Berlin with aristocratic disdain, and yet he was seduced, not by ideology. Halder was never a true believer in the sense that Himmler or Goebbels were. No, what seduced Halder was something far more intoxicating to a professional soldier: relevance. After years of the Weimar Republic's military restrictions, the regime was rebuilding Germany's armed forces, expanding them, funding them, celebrating them. For a career staff officer, this was paradise. On February 1st, 1938, Halder was promoted to General of the Artillery. 6 months later, he was appointed Chief of the General Staff of the Army High Command, the OKH. At 54 years old, Franz Halder had reached the pinnacle of his profession. He was now the operational brain of one of the most powerful armies on Earth, and almost immediately, he was drawn into conspiracy. Here's where the story gets complicated and revealing. The man Halder replaced as Chief of Staff was Ludwig Beck. Beck had resigned in protest over plans to invade Czechoslovakia. He was convinced it would trigger a European war that Germany couldn't win. Halder shared that assessment. He wasn't opposed to expansion. He wasn't opposed to the regime's goals. He was opposed to timing. Professional soldiers calculate risk, and Halder calculated that war with Britain and France in 1938 would be catastrophic. So when conservative nationalist officers approached him about joining a coup, Halder didn't say no. The conspiracy was organized by Hans Oster, deputy head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. The plan was straightforward. If orders came to invade Czechoslovakia, Halder would signal the conspirators. A raiding party would storm the Reich Chancellery. The regime would be overthrown. Some historians have called this the Halder conspiracy, rather than the Oster conspiracy, and there's truth to that. Halder was the linchpin. Without his support, without his willingness to signal the attack, nothing was possible. He met with Army Commander Walter von Brauchitsch. He coordinated with General Erwin von Witzleben, commander of the Berlin Defense District. The coup had real teeth. Everything was in place. And then, Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich. The Munich Agreement handed the Sudetenland to Germany without a shot being fired. The crisis evaporated. The leader was hailed as a diplomatic genius. His popularity soared to unprecedented heights. Halder's assessment? Hitler's position was too strong. The coup was abandoned. This is the pattern. This is the fatal flaw. Halder could plan. Halder could organize. Halder could see the disaster coming from miles away. But when the moment came to act, his nerve broke. A year later, history repeated itself. Poland had fallen in September. A masterpiece of mobile warfare that Halder had helped orchestrate. But the victory brought no peace. Instead, orders came for an offensive against France and the Low Countries. Halder was convinced it would be a disaster. A repeat of 1914. Trenches, stalemate, mutual annihilation. Once again, conspiracy beckoned. Halder and Brauchitsch discussed overthrowing the regime. The date was set. November 5, 1939. Brauchitsch would meet with the leader, attempt to talk him out of the offensive. If he failed, the so-called Zosen conspiracy was ready to launch. Brauchitsch went to the meeting. He argued against the invasion. He suggested, tentatively, that morale in the army was lower than it had been in 1918. The leader exploded. He berated Brauchitsch as incompetent, demanded to know which units had morale problems, accused the general staff of defeatism. Brauchitsch left the meeting shattered, and the conspiracy died. Days later, a civilian conspirator named Karl Friedrich Goerdeler met with Halder to beg him to reconsider, to proceed with the coup anyway. Halder's response is one of the most damning quotes in the historical record. One does not rebel when face to face with the enemy. Think about that. The man who had been plotting regime change for over a year suddenly discovered patriotism. The professional soldier who believed generals knew better than politicians suddenly decided to defer to civilian leadership. The truth is simpler and uglier. Halder was afraid. He carried a loaded pistol into every meeting with the leader. He later admitted this to interrogators. Whenever I go and see the Führer, I've got a loaded pistol in my pocket. He had the weapon. He had the opportunity. Year after year, meeting after meeting, he never used it. The invasion of France proved Halder wrong, spectacularly wrong. Erich von Manstein's audacious plan through the Ardennes succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. France fell in 6 weeks. The regime's faith in his own strategic genius was confirmed, and Halder's credibility with his commander was permanently damaged. But the war wasn't over. It was about to become something far worse. In July 1940, Halder began planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in human history. And this is where the moral accounting becomes unavoidable. Halder wasn't just a strategist in this campaign. He was an architect of atrocity. His staff drafted 2 orders that transformed the Eastern Front into something unprecedented in modern warfare. The first was the Commissar Order, issued June 6, 1941. It mandated the immediate execution of any Soviet political commissar captured by German forces. No trials, no prisoner status, summary execution. The second was even more sweeping. The Barbarossa Decree, signed May 13, 1941. This order freed German soldiers from prosecution for any crime committed against Soviet civilians. Any reason, any time. Halder didn't just approve these orders. He actively shaped them. He insisted on adding a clause giving officers the right to raze entire villages and execute the inhabitants. The author of these orders was Eugen Müller, who reported directly to Halder. There was no ambiguity about the chain of command. In his own directive, Halder declared that in the event of guerrilla attacks, German troops were to impose collective measures of force by massacring villages. The man who couldn't pull the trigger himself had no trouble authorizing others to kill on an industrial scale. This is the paradox of Franz Halder, the conspirator who was too moral to assassinate one man, the general who legalized the murder of millions. Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941. 3 million Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet frontier in the largest ground invasion ever mounted. Initially, success came so fast that even Halder was optimistic. By August, he was convinced the campaign was essentially won. Then came the first warning signs. In August 1941, Halder made a prescient observation that would haunt the German command. The Russian colossus has been underestimated by us. Whenever a dozen divisions are destroyed, the Russians replace them with another dozen. The summer turned into a running argument. Halder wanted to concentrate forces on Moscow. He believed capturing the capital would break Soviet resistance. It was classic military thinking. Strike the enemy's center of gravity. The leader disagreed. He wanted to seize Ukraine's resources, then the oil fields of the Caucasus. The dispute festered throughout the summer. Neither man would yield, and as the weeks passed, the window for taking Moscow before winter narrowed and then closed entirely. Operation Typhoon, the final push toward the Soviet capital, launched in October. Too late. Halder had shared the general staff's assumption that Moscow could fall before winter. He failed to ensure adequate cold weather gear for the troops. The consequences were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of German soldiers suffered frostbite as temperatures plunged to 40 below zero. The offensive ground to a halt on the outskirts of Moscow. On December 5, 1941, the Soviets counterattacked. Halder wrote in his diary that there was no more strength and withdrawal might be necessary. The regime's response was to assume direct command of the army and to begin treating Halder as a nuisance rather than an asset. The relationship between Halder and his commander deteriorated throughout 1942. The situation conferences became battlegrounds. The regime's diary entries from this period are revealing. He mocked Halder relentlessly, said he had spent the First World War sitting on that same swivel stool. Halder's own diary entries grew increasingly sarcastic. The mutual contempt was barely concealed. The breaking point came during the planning for Case Blue, the 1942 summer offensive toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Halder warned that the plan was overambitious, that splitting forces between 2 objectives was dangerous, that the flanks of the advance would be vulnerable. He told his commander that the Soviets would raise another 1 million men. He was dismissed as hysterical. When Halder presented intelligence on Soviet tank production, the leader flew into a rage of fury and threatened me with his fists. The final confrontation came in September. Halder had recently read a book about Anton Denikin's defeat in the Russian Civil War. The parallels to the current situation at Stalingrad were unmistakable. He tried to warn his commander. The Sixth Army was walking into the same trap that had destroyed Denikin's forces decades earlier. The leader concluded that Halder no longer possessed an aggressive war mentality. On September 24, 1942, Franz Halder was dismissed as Chief of Staff. The leader's parting words were delivered in private. Halder's nerves were worn out. They ought to part. What the leader really meant was clearer. He intended to educate the general staff in fanatical faith in the idea and enforce his will on an army that still clung to professional independence. Halder was sent to the Führer Reserve, irrelevant, discarded. 2 months later, the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad encircled the Sixth Army, exactly as Halder had warned. For nearly 2 years, Franz Halder lived in retirement, watching from the sidelines as the war turned irrevocably against Germany. He stayed in contact with Ludwig Beck. The old conspiratorial network still existed, though Halder was no longer at its center. Then came July 20th, 1944. The bomb planted by Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded at the Wolf's Lair. The regime survived, barely injured. The Gestapo's investigation was thorough, brutal, comprehensive. Under interrogation, the conspirators revealed everything, including the plots of 1938 and 1939, including Halder's involvement. On July 23, 1944, 3 days after the failed assassination, the Gestapo arrested Franz Halder. He hadn't participated in the July 20th plot, but his past had finally caught up with him. He was sent first to Flossenburg concentration camp, then to Dachau. His wife Gertrude chose to accompany him into imprisonment. She was allowed to do so, an unusual privilege that reflected Halder's status as a special prisoner. On January 31, 1945, with the Reich crumbling around him, Halder was officially dismissed from the army, the final humiliation. But Halder was lucky. Hans Oster, the man who had organized the 1938 conspiracy, was executed in April 1945. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, was hanged alongside him. Halder survived because he was transferred out of Dachau in the war's final weeks. He was part of a group of high-value prisoners, including former French Premier Léon Blum and former Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg, who were moved to a hotel in the Tyrolean Alps. American troops liberated the group in early May. Here's where the story takes its most remarkable turn. Franz Halder was captured by American forces. He was interrogated at Nuremberg. His personal diaries, detailed records of his time as Chief of Staff, provided prosecutors with invaluable evidence. But Halder was never tried as a war criminal, not because he was innocent. The diaries themselves documented his formulation of the Commissar Order and Barbarossa Decree. The prosecuting attorney at one point gained access to this evidence and pushed for a retrial. The Americans refused to allow it. The retrial was dropped in September 1950. Why? Because by then, Franz Halder had made himself indispensable. The Cold War had transformed everything. The Soviet Union was no longer an ally, but an existential threat. And Franz Halder possessed something the Americans desperately wanted: expertise on the Red Army. Starting in 1947, Halder began working for the U.S. Army Historical Division. His role was to assemble and supervise former Wehrmacht officers in creating a comprehensive operational account of the Eastern Front. Over the next 14 years, Halder oversaw the writing of more than 2,500 historical documents by approximately 700 former German officers. And here's where the con began. Halder didn't just collect military intelligence. He shaped the narrative. He instructed his writers to remove any material detrimental to the image of the German armed forces. He coached former officers on how to make incriminating evidence disappear. The result was a systematic falsification of history. Halder laid down a version of events that all writers had to follow. The army was the regime's victim. The generals had opposed the leader at every opportunity. The war in the East had been fought honorably. Any crimes were committed by the SS, not the Wehrmacht. This was the genesis of the clean Wehrmacht myth, a deliberate, orchestrated campaign of historical revisionism. And it worked. Halder's version of history spread first through the U.S. military, then through academic circles, then into popular culture. The memoirs of generals like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein, written under Halder's guidance, became bestsellers that reinforced the myth. The man who had drafted orders legalizing mass murder successfully convinced America that the German army had fought a noble war. In 1961, Franz Halder received the U.S. Meritorious Civilian Service Award. The medal was presented by Major General Edgar C. Doleman on behalf of President John F. Kennedy. Think about that for a moment. Franz Halder became the only German in history to be decorated by both the regime he had served and an American president. In 1939, he had received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his role in planning the invasion of Poland. In 1961, he received Kennedy's recognition for his contributions to American military education. The same man, the same career, two medals from opposing sides of history. During the 1960s, Halder became something of a historical icon. He fielded questions from historians and the general public. He lived quietly in Aschau im Chiemgau, Bavaria. He died on April 2, 1972, at the age of 87. So what do we make of Franz Halder? Historians have struggled with this question for decades. Ronald Smelser and Edward J. Davies, writing in The Myth of the Eastern Front, put it this way: Franz Halder embodies better than any other high German officer the dramatic difference between myth and reality as it emerged after World War II. The myth, a principled military professional who opposed the regime, plotted against the leader, and conducted war according to honorable traditions. The reality, a man who conspired but never acted, who planned atrocities while claiming moral superiority, who facilitated genocide while telling himself he was merely following orders, who rewrote history to escape accountability. Halder's fatal flaw wasn't cowardice in the conventional sense. He wasn't afraid of physical danger. He carried a loaded pistol for years. He survived concentration camps. His flaw was something more insidious: the inability to act on his own convictions. He could see the disaster coming. He could analyze it with perfect clarity. He could even plot against it. But when the moment came to choose, he always chose safety. He always chose the institution. He always chose himself. And millions of people died because men like Franz Halder couldn't find the courage to act on what they knew was right. There's a quote attributed to Halder from the Nuremberg interviews that captures his psychology perfectly. When explaining his fear of the leader, he said, "Whenever I go and see the Führer, I've got a loaded pistol in my pocket." He had the weapon for years, meeting after meeting, year after year. He never used it. That loaded pistol is the perfect metaphor for Franz Halder's life. All that potential, all that capability, all that opportunity, and in the end, just a man sitting on a swivel stool, making notes while the world burned. In 1995, the Hamburg Institute for Social Research opened an exhibition called War of Annihilation: Crimes of the Wehrmacht. It featured 1,380 photographs showing ordinary German soldiers participating in atrocities. The exhibition sparked a national debate in Germany. For the first time, the clean Wehrmacht myth faced systematic challenge. The myth that Franz Halder had spent 14 years constructing began to crumble. Today, historians recognize the Commissar Order and Barbarossa Decree for what they were: licenses for genocide, and they recognize Halder's role in drafting them. But the damage was done. For decades, the myth shaped how Americans understood the Second World War. It influenced military doctrine. It colored political relationships. One man, one systematic campaign of deception, and a false history that took half a century to unravel. That's the legacy of Franz Halder, the conspirator who couldn't, the architect of atrocity, the con artist who got away with it. Thanks for watching.